this anime is old enough to drink. Okay, picture this. It's 1998, you're 10 years old, you have no idea what anime is, DVDs aren't a thing yet, and nobody gives a shit about Y2K. And your friends have all gathered around the living room's 13-inch VCR combo set to watch this weird cartoon your buddy brought over on a bootleg tape. It's a cartoon from Japan called Slayers, and as the catchy 90s J-pop intro starts, you see this guy. And you're immediately in love. That's what Slayers was for me, an awakening of sorts. Not just an introduction to anime itself, nor the concept of husbandos before the term had even been coined, but a revelation into a new yet familiar type of storytelling. Slayers was, on the one hand, completely foreign, yet wholly intimate with the trappings of fantasy and comedy I'd grown up with so far. But for those who aren't ancient weeaboo mummies like me, what is Slayers? First airing in Japan in 1995, only a few short months before the titan that is Evangelion would come crashing through the anime genre's proverbial Wall Maria. Wow. 2 Attack on Titan references in the span of 2 videos. I really need to start referencing shows I actually like. The first season of Slayers, just known as Slayers or The Slayers, follows the exploits of the diminutive yet powerful sorceress Lena Inverse. Who is Lena Inverse? Well, for the first 26 episodes, she does a pretty good job telling you herself.
Where monsters rampage, I'm there to take them down. Where treasure glitters, I'm there to claim it. Where an enemy rises to face me, victory will be mine!
In the first season, we get the formation of our core cast, which stays throughout the rest of the series, starting with Lena's trusty mercenary companion and eventual love interest, Gauri Gabriev, the mysterious and tragic chimera, Zelgadis Greywords, and the spunky lover of justice and distributor of white magic-fueled punches, Amelia Will Tesla Seirun. Together, they journey through the world, battling the forces of evil, usually through said forces of evil either intentionally or accidentally pulling these characters into their schemes, ultimately to the villain's own detriment, which, in a way, is a cosmic joke worthy of the Lord of Nightmares herself. More on her later. Today, we will only be focusing on the original Slayer series, as I had to finally admit to myself that it was insane to try and do a 3-season retrospective in 2 months, on top of everything else going on in my life. I am no longer the carefree Slayers fan of my youth, but for now, just for now, let's take a look at the first season as though I was, and reflect on its legacy in the present day. The first thing that occurs to me watching this now is just how much this feels like someone's D&D campaign. The way the characters just spout joke after joke, often at the situation or villain's expense, as though the characters themselves are as trope-weary and as pop culture saturated as players would be.
You think you can just steal our treasure and get away with it? Do you, you little witch?
Do you, you little witch? Talk about lousy lines.
And if you're familiar at all with the way D&D campaigns often go, you begin to see that in the story structure as well. The way the first 10 episodes focus on a group of disparate, self-centered, houseless individuals with a tendency towards overkill, and their uncovering of a plot to revive a legendary Dark Lord, with the subsequent defeat of said Dark Lord paced almost exactly like a tabletop campaign of moderate length. Though I dare not guess at the level range, as Lena Inverse defies traditional RPG leveling systems. But once that's all said and done, you're left with 16 more episodes. And where does one go after defeating the big bad? This is, in fact, a question a lot of DMs find themselves asking when their group completes their level 3 to 6 one-off campaign, but the PCs really want to keep playing with their characters. And that's how you wind up with situations like the second half of the first season of Slayers. While it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, it is certainly going to throw off many viewers familiar with the exponential power escalation arms race that is most other long-form anime series. It's less a denouement and more of a miniature sequel season, with a gap of lighthearted filler episodes starting after episode 10, which would become the norm for preceding seasons afterward. By episode 14, we've arrived at the next major plot, which involves a clone of the previous villain and a demon beast that isn't as big a threat as the last one, but is still a threat in its own right. Coming back to the D&D analogy, what it really feels like to me is what happens when a player, in this case Gowry, isn't as familiar with the game, pick champion fighter, or the equivalent so they would have an easier time finding their footing, and has been given a plot hook involving their backstory by the DM, and it flies right over their head. That's what Cyrag is to me. Cyrag being the name of the city the latter half of the season takes place in, and hometown to the NPCs, I mean supporting characters relevant to Gowry's backstory. And now, this may be because the first season is actually a combination of the events of the second and fifth light novel, but the fact that it can give this impression to someone who grew up with both anime as well as Dungeons & Dragons is pretty entertaining. The comparisons really don't end there, with Lena representing the goal-oriented dungeon-crawling murder hobos, Zelgadis the character-centric angsty theatrical players, and Amelia, those players that really go all in on a gimmick.
Villains who hold no mercy for the weak! Heaven will hold none for you!
It won't?
The judgment of justice is now upon you!
To me, it's one of the things that helps set Slayers apart from its contemporaries. While a lot of 90s fantasy anime borrows or reinterprets tropes coming from the Western staples of the genre, and Journey to the West, like a lot of Journey to the West, they still tend to fit the mold of established anime tropes at the time. Nosebleeds, budget-saving chibis, grandiose narratives that have to be condensed into short-run OAVs until they are nonsensical, if not aesthetic messes. It's something anime has always been good at, turning known concepts on their heads, but often still adhering to the trappings of its own genre for top marketability within its core demographic. And at the time of Slayers, that demographic was firmly in the realm of Japanese otaku. So it's really amazing to me that Slayer seeks to go beyond this, beyond just being something like a mecha anime with magic or a proto-isekai, to provide the feel of a group of friends sitting around the table together rolling dice, while also being a delightful action comedy with an extremely solid lore and magic system. Now, that's not to say those other shows are bad, not by a long shot. I simply mean to illustrate the difference. There's a unique tone to Slayers that fantasy anime at the time just couldn't capture wholly, either leaning too hard into the raunchy comedy shtick, dire machismo, or pure shoujo elegance. The perfect example of this being the aforementioned lore and magic system. There is nothing in the core 3 seasons of Slayers that isn't introduced either by name or in concept in those first 10 episodes. From the Mizoku race to how magic functions, it's all right there. The only thing later seasons do is expand on concepts that have been mentioned previously. Heck, the demon beast Xanifer, the big bad in the latter half of the show, is mentioned in episode 7 by Gowry when he reveals that he's wielding the Sword of Light. A great deed mentioned in passing purely to give credence to the sword's legendary status becomes relevant canon a dozen episodes later. Point of fact, I would argue it's one of the best starter anime out there, worthy of being recommended to newcomers in the same breath as Cowboy Bebop or the Ghibli films. With its snappy dialogue, little dashes of angst, and mostly consequence-free collateral damage, I think it would especially appeal to younger audiences. It's an all-around solid action show that is so much less about the fan service, power levels, and other modern anime trappings, it's very refreshing. Which again, isn't to say modern anime's bad, it's just nice to have a breath of fresh air. There are a lot of reasons why anime is what it is now, but it's nice to visit a different time in anime's life and history and be treated to something outside the norm. Now, while I can fully admit that I am approaching this show with nostalgia goggles firmly on, the critical part of my brain can't rest without pointing out some of the show's weak points. The first thing one might notice is a few of the jokes haven't aged very well, whether it be the implications of Zolf's torture scene.
Hey, you'll love it, baby. Getting a kiss from me, the most handsome guy in my tribe.
I'd hate to see the rest of the tribe.
Or the drag on and very slight homophobia from episode 17, Slayers is most definitely a product of its time, with similar jokes being handled much more deftly even just a season later. More on that next time. What's more, while I, a big D&D nerd, can find the pacing of the show endearing based on my own experiences, others might find the show slow, if not downright boring, depending on your preferences. And this one is definitely more personal to me, but I super didn't remember Lena Inverse being only 15 at the start of season 1. Like, who let this rowdy child out into the world with this much destructive power? Where are your parents? Then again, that might also be a point in the show's favor as to why it resonated so much with me when I was a teen watching it, so... The loud and unapologetic antics of Lena really struck a chord in my anxious little heart, encouraging me, and I would hazard to guess a lot of people like me, to be more assertive. That little girls didn't just have to sit by and be wilting bastions of femininity, or even elegant heroines. And I think then, more so than now, that's what Slayers was for me. I mentioned at the top of the video it was an awakening, but not just to the world of anime, but to a part of myself I didn't know I could have. A louder, more confident, chaotic part that was born not just from Lena Inverse, but the bold, frenzied antics of the show itself. While the latter half may sound strange on paper, it ultimately reinforces what's good about the series as a whole. A standout fantasy comedy from the 90s that's confident enough in its own characters and setting not to just follow tropes or trappings of the era or genre. It was unique for its time, and I would argue it's unique to this day. While that's not to say it's perfect, it is without a doubt fun. Okay, but one last thing. I would just like to point out how funny it is that Copy Rezo just flies around punching people in the finale instead of doing magic. Like, a squishy spellcaster just socking a fighter is inherently funny to me.